This might be the biggest what if in history. No USA, no Russia, maybe not even Australia. And you? You wouldn't be watching this video or any video because you'd probably be gone. But let's set that aside for a moment. Imagine this man controlling the entire world.
Diese beiden Einrichtungen gemeinsam den deutschen Menschen erziehen und festigen und auf ihren Schultern tragen, den deutschen Staat, das Deutsche Reich.
Yes, Adolf Hitler, the man who was on more drugs than Snoop Dogg. Except these weren't for fun. They were meant to keep him going, fueling his obsessive and destructive plans. But how was he planning to do it? How could Hitler have actually taken over the world, and what would life have been like if he had succeeded? Born in 1889 in a small Austrian town near the Austrian-German border, he was just an innocent child. It was only later that his soul became corrupted, and he turned into a monster. Hitler's father, Alois, worked as a customs official, and his mother, Clara, came from a poor farming family. The family was financially stable, but his father was strict, and Adolf often clashed with him. In primary school, Hitler was smart and popular, but in secondary school he became withdrawn, spending more time reenacting battles from the Boer War than studying. He left school at 16 with no qualifications. Hitler's dream was to become an artist, but his father wasn't supportive. After his father died in 1903, Hitler pursued his dream. He applied to several art schools, but was rejected. He moved to Vienna and lived a tough life, staying in hostels and painting postcards to survive. During this time, he started forming the ideas that would later shape his beliefs, including his desire to unite Germany and Austria. He was especially influenced by the anti-Semitic politics of Vienna's mayor, Karl Lueger. Hitler despised the multi-ethnic makeup of Austria's Habsburg Empire. To avoid military service, he moved to Munich in 1913. Hitler wanted to show his loyalty to Germany. When World War I broke out in August 1914, he quickly enlisted. In the army, he found purpose and a cause he could fully embrace. He served in France and Belgium and was decorated twice for bravery. In 1916, he was wounded at the Battle of the Somme, one of the war's bloodiest battles. While recovering, he adopted the iconic toothbrush mustache. Later, he was injured again in a British gas attack. While recovering in Passau, Germany surrendered, something Hitler couldn't believe. Before the surrender, Germany's leaders had tried to shift the blame for the looming defeat, giving more power to the Reichstag, but also implicating them in the failure. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated just before the armistice. Like many, Hitler was furious, blaming Jews and socialists for betraying the German army. This anger pushed him to enter politics. Germany's government was close to collapsing, and Hitler tried to start a revolution. On November the 8th, Bavarian Prime Minister Gustav Kahr was addressing businessmen at a beer hall in Munich when Hitler stormed in with his SA paramilitary forces. At gunpoint, Kahr was forced to pledge his support. The next day, Hitler led 3,000 men into the streets, but the police were ready. In the violence that followed, 16 Nazis and 3 policemen were killed. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for treason. He served only 9 months in Landsberg prison, where he wrote Mein Kampf, which laid out his political ideas. For Hitler, the state was not based on economics, but on race. He declared the superiority of the white Aryan race and targeted Jews, calling them parasites and saying their elimination must necessarily be a bloody process. Mein Kampf described a future Nazi Germany with military expansion, the elimination of impure races, and a dictatorship. After its publication in 1925, Hitler's ideas gained more exposure. Now a German citizen, Hitler led the Nazis to win over 37% of the vote, in the July 1932 elections, becoming the largest party in Germany. Concerned about the rise of communism, President von Hindenburg made Hitler chancellor in January. Hitler quickly consolidated his power, and by March, he had dictatorial authority thanks to the Enabling Act, which allowed him to pass laws without the Reichstag's approval. Political parties, unions, and organizations not aligned with the Nazis were soon dissolved. By securing dictatorial powers, Hitler set his plan into motion. Political opponents were eliminated, and with the army on his side, he prepared for the next step: war. Over the next few years, Nazi Germany expanded across Europe with ruthless efficiency. The world was plunged into conflict as Hitler sought to achieve his vision, outlined in Mein Kampf: military dominance, racial purification, and a totalitarian regime. Now is when we start changing the course of history and look into what would have happened if Hitler, the world's greatest villain, had won the war. But first, let's imagine how he could have won if he only had a little more luck. There were key moments where the tide could have easily turned in his favor. In 1940, the Battle of Britain was hanging by a thread. Had the Luftwaffe continued targeting British airfields instead of switching to bombing cities, the Royal Air Force could have been crushed, leaving Britain defenseless against invasion. With no British resistance, Hitler could have launched Operation Sea Lion and taken control of the UK, eliminating a major threat from the West. On the Eastern Front, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was another turning point. By October 1941, German troops were just 40 miles from Moscow, and the Soviet government was in a panic. If the Germans had pushed harder before the brutal winter set in, Moscow could have fallen, potentially collapsing the Soviet Union. Without the Soviet Union's resistance, Hitler would have gained control of vast resources and manpower, strengthening his war machine. In the Atlantic, the war could have also swung Germany's way. The U-boat campaigns nearly crippled British supply lines, and if the Germans had been more successful in cutting off American and British trade routes, the Allies would have struggled to sustain their war efforts. The entry of the United States into the war was another critical moment. Hitler underestimated American industrial and military power. Had Japan not attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. might have delayed its involvement, giving Hitler more time to consolidate his power in Europe and focus on defeating the Soviets. After taking over Europe, Hitler would have turned his attention to starting World War III. His ambitions didn't stop at Europe. He envisioned a global empire with plans to dominate not just Europe, but also Africa, the Middle East, and eventually North and South America. With Britain subdued and the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States would be isolated, standing as the last major power capable of resisting the Nazi regime. In his vision, Hitler believed that the U.S. was a weak mongrel nation, divided by race and ethnicity, and therefore no match for his Aryan superpower. He would have launched an all-out campaign against the U.S., possibly starting with a prolonged aerial bombardment or using advanced weapons he hoped to develop, like the America bomber, designed to reach the American mainland, or even rockets like the V-2, which could have been adapted for long-range attacks. Without the Soviet and British fronts to drain his resources, Hitler would have thrown everything he had into building a massive fleet and expanding Germany's nuclear weapons program. With control over the vast resources of Europe, including the industrial powerhouses of France and Germany, and with the oil fields of the Middle East now under Nazi control, he could have accelerated technological advancements, putting immense pressure on the U.S. As World War III unfolded, Nazi forces would likely have invaded South America to establish a foothold closer to the U.S., creating a staging ground for attacks. Countries like Brazil or Argentina, which had fascist sympathies, might have been swayed to join Hitler's new order, tipping the balance in the Western Hemisphere. At home in Europe, Hitler would have solidified his totalitarian grip. The Holocaust, already claiming millions of lives, would have continued unchecked, wiping out Jews, Romani, Slavs, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Entire regions would have been transformed into labor camps to fuel the Nazi war machine, and the oppressive control of Nazi ideology would have seeped into every part of life. With the world divided and consumed by never-ending wars, it's hard to imagine any corner of the globe not falling under Hitler's shadow. A global Nazi regime would have brought widespread suffering, destruction, and the complete erasure of individual freedoms. Humanity, as we know it, might have been lost forever under the boot of a brutal dictatorship that sought to reshape the world through violence, terror, and genocide. If Hitler had won, life around the world would have been terrifying and bleak. In Europe, Nazi rule would have wiped out millions more in their quest for a pure, Aryan race. Eastern Europe would have become a massive labor camp, with people living in fear of being arrested or killed for stepping out of line. Everything from education to the arts would be controlled, with schools teaching kids about racial superiority and any form of free thought or creativity banned. It would be a world where propaganda was everywhere, and speaking your mind could cost you your life. In the Middle East and Africa, the Nazis would have taken control of resources like oil and diamonds. The local populations would either be enslaved or wiped out, and the entire continent would have been turned into colonies that served Nazi Germany. In Asia, the Nazis would likely turn on Japan after using them during the war, taking over China, Korea, and Southeast Asia with the same brutal methods they used in Europe. In South America, countries like Argentina and Brazil, which had some fascist leanings, might have teamed up with the Nazis. The United States, if not already defeated, would have been left isolated, struggling to defend itself from an all-powerful Nazi regime. Life in the U.S. would be lived under constant threat of attack, and American values like freedom and democracy would be under siege. For most people, life under Nazi control would be about survival. Fear would dominate daily life, with secret police and informants ensuring any sign of resistance was crushed. Everyone would be under surveillance, and even a whisper of dissent could mean imprisonment or worse. Entire cultures and nations would be wiped out or reshaped to fit the Nazi worldview. The world would have become a place of rigid racial hierarchies, where only those who fit the Nazi ideal had any real privileges. Everyone else would be oppressed, enslaved, or eliminated. Freedom, human rights, and individuality would have been things of the past, replaced by a system built on fear, control, and violence. In the end, if Hitler had won, the world would have been unrecognizable, a future dominated by fear, oppression, and endless war. But history didn't go his way. The world united against the greatest threat it had ever faced and fought back, proving that even in the darkest times, humanity can resist and overcome. We look back at this what if not just as a nightmare averted, but as a reminder of how close we came and how important it is to stand up for freedom and justice, no matter the cost.